Hello everyone, my name is Doc, and welcome to another Temporary Worlds Let's Read. Today we're reading a book chapter by Rolf Nohr from the book How to Play Video Games. And in this book chapter, Nohr is writing about the concept of rules in computer games, focusing on the example of Tetris. And if we wanted to put Nohr's argument in just a single sentence, we might say here in this abstract that Nohr is contending that we must analyze what he calls both explicit internal rules and all those implicit external regulations that color gaming experiences. Of course, we might ask, what exactly do any of those things mean, and what do they have to do with what we think of when we think of rules in computer games? Well, Nohr starts out this book chapter by talking about a little bit about the history of Tetris, but then talking about exactly that, the things we typically think of as rules in computer games. Here, Nohr cites a classic rule from a classic game, Atari's Pong from 1972, the arcade machine version of Pong. And apparently on this machine, there was an explicit rule given: avoid missing ball for high score. This is something that makes a lot of sense, and certainly lines up with what I think we mostly think of when we think of rules. We think of something that one is supposed to do within the game towards some sort of goal, right? We're trying to achieve a high score by doing something. And Nohr reformulates this rule structure to describe Tetris as well, which, as he argues earlier here in the essay, is often understood to be this classic example of a game with very simple rules but very complex and difficult to master emergent gameplay from that rule. Taking a little twist on Pong's rule, Nohr summarizes Tetris's rule as avoid gap in line for high score. I think it would be totally fair to say that this is, for the most part, how we think about rules in computer games. It is something explicit that we're supposed to do that's totally within the gaming context. However, Nohr really wants to draw our attention to a different set of rules that also structure our gameplay experience. In this second quote here, Nohr writes that games are more than winning and losing. Moreover, a game's manifest rules of play are accompanied by a number of other, often far less obvious, regulations and expectations that shape the experience. A myriad of internalized and not so obvious social and cultural codes. Nohr wants to make the case that we also need to think about these kinds of less obvious social expectations and regulations that we could, in fact, call rules, and which do, in fact, constitute a large part of how we choose to play games. Now, one might be thinking, what kind of social expectations exist in this very abstract and simple game of Tetris? Well, further down in the essay, Nohr gives us a great example. Nohr writes, "One who plays Tetris to create beautifully complex patterns as an expression of free play, and not to clear the screen of its multi-shaped tetronymos, is no longer playing Tetris according to the stated rules. Thus, rules are closely associated with ethical, communicative, and psychosocial processes dealing with what is deemed to be socially proper and improper behaviors." I think this example is really helpful and illustrative because we can all imagine the idea of playing Tetris to create patterns. We might not do it very well to start, but we can immediately see and feel that that's against the typical way of playing Tetris with its timer and its constantly falling blocks, encouraging us to focus on getting rid of new shapes. Whereas in this mode of play, we would have a completely different goal that certainly falls outside of some vague feeling of what should be done or how Tetris should be played. And to describe this distinction between these two kinds of rules, Nohr actually puts two very helpful terms on the table for us, further down here in the book chapter. At this fourth quote, Nohr is citing philosopher John R. Searle, who makes a distinction between constitutive rules and regulative rules. Building off of Searle's work, Nohr writes that constitutive rules are those that enable actions. Without these types of rules, the game and its competition between players could not exist. Constitutive rules are negotiated, are based on agreement, and are explicitly stated. On the other hand, Nohr writes, Searle's regulative rules are sometimes ambiguous and implicit standards that structure intersubjective social cooperation. They're closely connected to a society's common sense and are, for the most part, invisible and naturalized. Regulative rules are taken for granted and are social conventions that are accepted without question. I think it's immediately apparent how these two terms help us understand that Tetris example with a little bit more clarity. That feeling that we have of building multicolored shapes using Tetris as something that doesn't fit with how Tetris is supposed to be played is really just a demonstration that there actually was an unspoken, common sense, regulative rule helping to structure Tetris, along with its other rule that we stated earlier of avoid gap in line for high score. And interestingly, it's a violation of the regulative rule which brings our attention to it. And Nohr also thinks there's something important about rule violations which help us understand the importance of different kinds of rules. Further down in the book chapter, Nohr focuses explicitly on rule violations and how they help us, quote, conceptualize a space of rules outside and beyond the limits of the game itself. Nohr begins by talking about violations of constitutive rules, those explicit rules which are internal to the game. As Nohr writes, the internet abounds with sites cataloging hints, cheat codes, and walkthrough tutorials, and that these things are an integral part of gaming communities. And interestingly, Nohr argues here that using a cheat code to best Tetris's unrelenting waterfall of shapes is not the overriding of a stated rule, but an imminent possibility in the source code itself. It's here that we see a contrast with Bollock and Lemieux's description of games as equipment for making metagames, the idea that changing the equipment is no longer to be operating in the space of rules. Nohr is advancing a very different understanding of rules here, relying on the flexibility and the malleability of code itself to argue that that alteration is still within the realm of playing with the rules. And then in this next paragraph, Nohr talks more explicitly about violations of those regulatory rules, those implicit, unspoken rules. And here we see some of those practices that we described in metagaming return. Nohr writes that gaming practices like trick jumping or using recorded gameplay to produce short films, a practice often referred to as machinima, are common play practices that actually go against the typical or socially expected way of playing games, but which are nonetheless very interesting, meaningful, and core elements of gaming culture. Nohr admits that these kinds of practices are more common in open-world sandbox-style games like Grand Theft Auto V and Minecraft. But ultimately, Nohr writes, these examples may be regarded as atypical player behavior, yet they are nevertheless expressive actions that deviate from the presumed norms regarding the way games are supposed to be played. And so ultimately, I think that Nohr's work here with these two terms of constitutive and regulatory rules is really helpful. And I think that focusing on violations really does help us see how these two kinds of rules really do exist and are distinct from one another, that there are really meaningful and expressive ways of breaking these rules, which don't abolish the play situation, but simply change it, and that it is perhaps particularly in these interesting rule-breaking moments where free and creative play can emerge most easily. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope it helped you think differently about games and play, and I hope that it inspired you to read this chapter yourself and to see what you can find in it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.